How far do you think we're going to get with this today?
Well, I think this is a second step. We had stage one of those negotiations on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. This is a step up from that. This is an effort to try and advance the ball even a little bit down the field. As you mentioned, I think it's important that we really put in place some significant space for humanitarian exits from some of those conflict areas. The Russians thus far have not been true to their word, and I think that is going to be a real test in what comes out of here. Will Moscow abide by the commitments that they make?
That's the big question, isn't it? Because, it seems as if Ukrainians are willing to move on the question of NATO membership. But at the same point, you've got to remember that they are talking about these two disputed regions and they want guarantees, not necessarily approval, if you will.
No, and Moscow's demands are unreasonable, to put it mildly. They're saying essentially you have to cede large portions of your country, Donetsk, Luhansk, as well as Crimea, to us or to these so-called independent republics. And in addition to that, you have to swear off one of the most sacred rights that a country has, which is to determine its own security arrangements. And while you rightly mentioned, Hadley, that President Zelensky is apparently willing to negotiate on that point, I don't know that that's a huge departure from where they have been. I think it's a concession that if it's the price of peace, then the Ukrainians may be willing to say, look, we don't need NATO membership for the foreseeable future. We already have, quite frankly, significant support from NATO.
Absolutely. And I think there's something interesting in that, because Zelensky in his interview with ABC News essentially was saying that the reason that they are foregoing, if you will, or potentially foregoing that NATO membership is because they've realized that NATO members do not have an appetite for conflict. And that's in spite of the fact that we've seen such a huge buildup in NATO forces along the Eastern European borders. And of course, those are NATO countries. Do you feel at all as if the West has failed Ukraine? Because technically, not being a member of NATO, there was not that much that they could have done.
Well, look, I think what we've seen play out is this artificial line in the sand that has been drawn. And in some ways, it's been drawn a little bit too harshly, in President Biden saying, we will not cede and we will defend every inch of NATO territory. And yet we, on the other side, are witnessing just these horrific images of children's hospitals being attacked, of civilians being attacked as they try to escape. And there is a moral, if not even a legal question that is looming large here. Does NATO, does the international community have an obligation to go beyond what we've already seen, which obviously are some of the most significant sanctions that have been imposed on any country to date, Russia having surpassed Iran in that respect, as well as providing some of those lethal defensive weapons, which were hotly debated when I was in the Situation Room back in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine.
Brett, Dan here in Abu Dhabi. I wanted to get your take on the impact of those sanctions overall. Of course, the latest being this ban on Russian oil imports. This acts as both a tool of deterrence, it's a tool of punishment, but at the same time, it's also a tool of leverage that could ultimately be used in these negotiations. How do you see these sanctions being used as leverage? And is there any chance that we could see sanctions relief in exchange for some kind of exit from Ukraine?
Well, I think that's precisely the point, Dan. What the West has accomplished by imposing such harsh sanctions allows them to walk back a portion of them while at the same time maintaining a significant level of pressure on Moscow. Because what we have learned over the last several decades is that Russia is not necessarily going to follow a linear path out of a deal. They are often going to zig and zag and try to circle back to where they were before. So it's really important that we continue to have a significant amount of pressure in place that whatever deal is put in place, as we saw with the Minsk agreements for the initial Russian invasion back in 2014, and they tried to wiggle out of that agreement. So we need to learn some important lessons from that and ensure that this time around, Putin is not able to escape as easily.
And Brett, just before we let you go, what do you think the biggest risk is in the next 24 to 48 hours? And what should we be watching as these talks between Russia and Ukraine get underway in Turkey?
Well, I think this question of what the Ukrainians are willing to concede, and we will hear perhaps more of that, obviously the point on potentially writing off NATO membership, but are there concessions on the territorial integrity of Ukraine? Because if Zelensky, in the interest of trying to save lives, in the interest of trying to get to a peace, is willing to say, look, we still will in name claim Crimea, but at this point, we are not going to seek its immediate return. That would be another point of concession, which will be one to watch, and perhaps a deal could be had in that space.
Brett, we'll leave it there. Really appreciate your take on the situation. That's Brett Bruen there from the Global Situation Room. He's former Director of Global Engagement at the White House and a former US diplomat. Brett, thanks again. Hadley, we'll come back out to you as soon as we can.